Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Nick Hilera Show. Our guest this week is Eugene Volokh, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford and a professor emeritus at UCLA Law. Eugene, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to having this conversation. Throughout the past 6 or 7 months, we have been covering sort of systematically every issue that we could possibly think of that might come up on the campaign trail for the presidency and the presidential election here in America. And free speech has been on the list. And I wanted to find someone who's been immersed in that world. And so you're the perfect guest for that, and appreciate you being here.
Always a pleasure to talk about that.
Awesome. Well, I figured a good place to start this is I listened to one of your podcast recordings on another show where you sort of were talking about the difference between the free speech movement and the free speech debate that was occurring in the 1960s on college campuses and the one that was occurring, just several months ago in light of the protests over the war in Gaza. And I just wanted you to describe that. What are the differences that you're seeing between those two moments in time?
I'm sorry, I don't exactly remember that podcast where I try to draw the differences. Part of the problem is that I'm not a scholar of the free speech movement of the 1960s. I have a loose sense of it, but I can't really compare and contrast. I can tell you what's going on right now.
Great.
And it's the overlay of several different kinds of controversies and different kinds of movements and submovements. On one hand, we have seen, maybe even I shouldn't say on one hand because there are going to be several hands. That's too many. So first, we have over the last several years, maybe 10, 15 years, seen calls to restrict speech on campuses when that speech has been seen as offensive or hostile based on race or religion or sexual orientation or gender identity or sex. So attempts to restrict speech by students, by faculty, by invited speakers that people found offensive based on one or another of those categories. Most of those attempts in this particular subcategory have come from the left. And the sense was that, people say things that are perceived as anti-Muslim or anti-trans or anti-gay, or not even necessarily hateful, but just things like, well, I don't think that transgender athletes, somebody might say, should compete in women's sports. Things like that. There have been attempts to restrict that because of the view that they help create a supposedly hostile environment based on race, again, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and the like. In fact, the attempts have gone pretty far. For example, many people have heard of the talk of microaggressions, the theory that even minor statements statements that may be offensive in a small way put together create this bad environment. So there were calls to label as microaggressions things like people saying America is the land of opportunity, or there's only one race, the human race, the theory being that denies the experience of racial minorities and especially blacks. So that's one movement. A second movement had been coming mostly from the right. Attempts to restrict, and this happened especially in recent years, attempts to restrict speech that has been seen as kind of racially divisive from the right. So, for example, there's the Stop Woke Act in Florida, which tries to restrict professors from teaching certain list of enumerated subjects, including that some identity groups are inherently better than others, or inherently worse than others, or whatever else. And if you look closely at it, it would even prevent real discussions of, for example, of gender differences and of questions as to whether there should be different teams for men and women, sports teams, for example, for men and women, which are questions that turn on identity differences. So that has come sort of as a pushback to the first movement from the right. The first movement has mostly come from students, administrators. The second one has mostly come from state legislatures. And then there's this overlay over the last year having to do with speech about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where there have been attempts to restrict, or calls, let's say, to restrict sharply anti-Israel or pro-Hamas speech. Most of those calls have come loosely speaking from the right, although some from the center as well, and then calls to defend that kind of speech, mostly from the left. I actually think that the defense of that kind of speech is quite correct. I think that even calls for the killing of Israelis are constitutionally protected speech, even though I very much disagree with them. But they do sit uneasily with the first movement that I was talking about, where there are attempts to restrict even microaggressions based on race, religion, national origin. Well, this sounds like a lot more of a macroaggression, and yet people are saying, again, in this instance, I think correctly, that it should be protected. But there's also, in the third movement, there have also been not just attempts to restrict speech based on its content and its viewpoint, which I think are quite unsound, but also attempts to restrict sit-ins, demonstration, campouts, as it were, and various kinds of genuinely disruptive behavior on campus, and behavior that's disruptive not because of its message, because people sort of try to physically occupy spaces that don't belong to them, or belong to others at least as much as they belong to them. So there have been attempts, and I think in this instance quite sound attempts, to say, look, if you want to express your views, that's fine, but you can't take over a building for that. You can't take over open space. You can't exclude from that open space people you don't like or that you disagree with or that disagree with. So that all of these things happening was complicated enough before the October 7th attacks, when just the first two movements were in play. Now we've got this third one.
Okay. So just for what it's worth, I want to get into all three of these, but for what it's worth, what I remember from your other podcast, you were basically commenting that you found it to be interesting that in the 60s, the movement was based upon the students attempting to be able to say what they want to say. They were essentially using the First Amendment in a positive way. And now it's like the opposite. Like basically students are trying to restrict speech, when in the 60s they were trying to get free speech. That was the point you had made, which I thought was
right. I hope I made it a little bit more subtly than that. Part of the problem is the students. It's not like there is one group. We are the students. We've got nationwide leadership. There's a platform. There's an agenda. Right? Students are a group of millions of people, right? So I'm sure in the 60s there were students who were perfectly happy to see other students' speech restricted, as well as students who wanted to see the speech protected. So I don't want to say, oh, well, in the 60s the students were all one way, and today students are all another way. For that, we have to have a good sense of how the students are today, and even that's hard to know. There are some polls, but it's hard to exactly figure them out. But also, we'd have to know what those students were like in the 60s as well. And I'm not sure there were really good polls on that. And if there were, I didn't read them, and I certainly wasn't around back then. So I don't want to draw too much by way of historical kind of big picture comparisons.
Fair. So as it stands, if we think about these three currents, like what is the law? Like what is the state of the constitutional law with respect to these various movements? So let's start with yeah.
Well, right. So instead of talking about the movements as such, let me just talk about various kinds of restrictions. And we can break them down kind of as follows. First, what about student speech? And let's start with public universities. Public and private universities are legally quite different. What are student speech rights in public universities? The general rule is that public universities cannot suppress student speech, at least outside the classroom, where speech necessarily is highly regulated, cannot suppress student speech based on its viewpoint, and usually not even based on its content. So racist speech is protected, whether it's black racist or white racist. Anti-racist speech is protected, however you define anti-racist. Anti-Semitic speech is protected. Anti-Muslim speech is protected. Anti-police speech is protected. Anti-American speech is protected. Universities cannot expel or discipline students for that kind of speech, including when there was this talk last fall in Congress about, well, what about advocacy of genocide? Yeah, of course, advocacy of genocide is generally constitutionally protected. It's a viewpoint like any other, and especially given how broadly genocide is at times defined. I mean, you have people calling the Israeli attack on Gaza genocide. I think that's wrong, just under the definition of genocide that I'm familiar with. But people have their own definitions often, or their own applications of definition. So, is it permissible for people to say Israelis should attack Gaza, and if that means tens of thousands of Palestinians die, that's just the reality? Just like when we retaliated against the Japanese, it ended up causing the deaths of millions of Japanese. Well, that's war. Is that speech protected? Absolutely. Is it advocacy of genocide? Doesn't matter for purposes of constitutional protection. Likewise, if somebody says, Hamas is waging a war of liberation and civilians are legitimate targets, and if that means they have to kill a lot of Israelis, that's what they need to do. It's definitely not my view, but again, that view is constitutionally. So student speech cannot be suppressed based on its viewpoint. However, it can be suppressed I shouldn't say suppressed. Its time, place, and manner of such speech can be restricted in content-neutral ways. So, for example, one common restriction is you can't have a demonstration inside a building. Certainly not. You can't take over offices that belong to or that are occupied by particular university professors or staffers or administrators. You can't even have a demonstration in the middle of kind of the main hallway in a building, because that's not a place for demonstrations. That's a place for students to get to class. That's a content-neutral restriction on speech. It is perfectly constitutional. Likewise, while there's some right to demonstrate in public spaces at universities, generally speaking, I oversimplify, but generally speaking, the university can say you can't camp out, you can't sleep in these places, because that means you're essentially taking over this space to the exclusion of other people. Likewise, you can't physically exclude people by setting up checkpoints which only your friends and your allies can come through. It's not your property. It's the university's property. It's the public property. It should be something that's accessible to all students and not just whoever decides they want to take it over. Those are content-neutral rules. They can be enforced. They can be enforced through threat of discipline. Ultimately, if students persist in doing this and don't heed calls to stop, they can be enforced through arrest and criminal prosecution. And I think they should be. Because whatever messages you want to express, you don't have the right to express them again in ways that take over other people's space. So that's student speech. Again, we can have a whole podcast just about that, and many podcasts just about that. What about speech of invited speakers, outside speakers? Well, generally speaking, even a public university doesn't have to open up the university space to outside speakers, especially, say, classrooms. We could say classrooms are for our classes. But most universities do open up such space to speakers invited by student groups. So they generally say, we like the idea of student groups inviting outside speakers, provides extra perspectives, extra ideas to our students. So if you're a registered student organization, you're entitled to invite a speaker and reserve a room for that speaker. Maybe if it's a very big room, we'll require you to rent the room. If it's a normal classroom, we generally allow you to use it, so long, of course, as there are no classes and no other groups that are using it. Once the university does that, it likewise cannot exclude speakers based on viewpoint. It can't say, we don't want to hear Ben Shapiro because he's too conservative. They can't say, we don't want to hear Cornel West because he's too far on the left. That's a pretty well settled rule, and again, it doesn't give anybody the right to just go on campus themselves and take over those rooms, but it does say that if they're invited by a student group, and if the university allows student groups to invite speakers, the university can't then restrict that based on viewpoint. Now, what about faculty? Well, that needs to be broken up into two subcategories. Again, we're still talking just about public universities. So faculty at public universities generally have very broad rights to speak in public. For example, speak in op-eds or speak in tweets or speak in their scholarship without being fired based on the viewpoint expressed in that speech. Again, it could be sharply pro-Israel, sharply pro-Palestinian, sharply anti-American. It could be racist, could be sexist, could be whatever else. They have the right to express their views. And that's sometimes seen as under the rubric of academic freedom, but it's also protected specifically by First Amendment law. When we're talking about speech and scholarship and speech and kind of public commentary. Now, one important little asterisk here is when faculty are evaluated for tenure, faculty are evaluated for promotion afterwards, you can't evaluate people in a content neutral way, maybe not even a viewpoint neutral way. If I'm reading the scholarship, or excuse me, if somebody is up for tenure at a university where I teach, I used to teach until a short while ago at UCLA, somebody was up for tenure, we'd have to read his work and see if it's good, see if it's sound, see if it's thoughtful. And how can you do that without looking at content, right? Obviously, you need to look at the content and again at the viewpoints. If somebody expresses some viewpoints, let's say just about science that are way outside the mainstream, on the one hand, that could be really valuable. That's where a lot of great ideas come from. But on the other hand, they're going to need to do a lot more work to show that those viewpoints are correct, precisely because they are contrary to conventional wisdom. So in any event, in the process of evaluating people for tenure and promotion, you have to consider what they wrote. But you can't just fire someone saying, look, you may be tenured already, or even if you're not tenured, you're not yet up for tenure, but we're just going to fire you because we don't like your views. But what about inside the classroom? See, when I'm writing an op-ed or when I'm writing an article, I'm putting it out there for people to read, whether they if they want to read it, right? Whereas if I'm teaching a class, I'm teaching essentially a captive audience of students, sometimes ones who are assigned to me. It may be a required class, and I'm giving them credit towards their degree. I'm essentially teaching on behalf of the university. What if my dean says, look, I want you to teach, when you teach First Amendment law, I want you to teach these subjects and not some other subjects, because we think that's what students really need to know. Or let's say I'm teaching criminal law and there are 4 sections of criminal law that are to which students are assigned. We want to harmonize the curriculum so that everybody learns more or less the same thing. As a practical matter, at most higher educational institutions, at least research universities, deans don't try to do that. They do leave a lot of discretion to faculty. But what if they say, no, this is what we want you to teach. Maybe even this is how we want you to teach. We think that this particular way of teaching things is unsound. There's a better way of teaching. Or even we want you to teach particular viewpoints. Now that, I think, a lot of that would be seen as violating academic freedom principles, especially we want you to teach certain viewpoints and not other viewpoints. But does it violate the First Amendment? Do faculty have the right to, again, teaching to government-provided students who are there for a degree that would be issued by this government institution? Do the faculty have a right to control that curriculum and control what they teach, how they teach, what viewpoints they express? That is an interesting and unsettled question. I think all I can say honestly is it's unsettled. I've filed a friend of the court brief and challenging the Florida Stop Woke Act. I think we've got really good arguments that indeed that law is unconstitutional. But the reality is that different courts have reached somewhat different results. The Supreme Court has not squarely spoken to this question. So I think we have to honestly say, the law is not fully clear, at least as to most things. I do think the Stop Woke Act is unusually constitutionally troublesome. But as to many things, the law is not particularly clearly settled. So finally, I know I've talked for a long time here, but there's been a lot to cover. Let's turn to private universities, because of course many universities are private. So the First Amendment only applies to government institutions. First word of the First Amendment is Congress. Congress shall make no law. Originally, it applied only to the federal government. The 14th Amendment starts with no state shall, and then, among other things, basically deny people their rights. Well, that applies to states and local governments and to public universities. What about private universities? Well, private universities are not bound by the Constitution, nor does it matter that they get a lot of government funds. The fact that an institution takes government funds does not by itself subject it to First Amendment constraints. But a lot of those universities have by contract said, we're essentially promising free speech protection to our students, promising academic freedom protections to our faculty. Those contracts may be enforceable, and many courts have said essentially the university has voluntarily agreed to abide by the same free speech rules that govern public universities. It may make sense, right? Maybe University of Pennsylvania doesn't want to be seen as providing less protection than, say, Penn State, a public university in the same state. Also, one state, my own California, actually has a state statute that limits colleges' ability to restrict their students' speech. And a bunch of states, including my own California, but some others as well, have state statutes that limit universities' ability, limit all employers, private employers, maybe public employers, university employers, other employers, limit all employers' ability to restrict their employees' political activity, differently defined in different states. So that might provide some statutory protection for example, a faculty member tweeting out some things, some political things that people might find offensive. So that's the big picture. Now, you can talk a lot about specific details. Note, I haven't talked yet about the exceptions to First Amendment protection. I mean, even when there is First Amendment protection, there are exceptions for things like true threats of criminal conduct or solicitation of criminal conduct. So there was a whole bunch else going on, but that's the big picture.
Yeah, no, that was super helpful because I find it hard to kind of keep all this as someone who doesn't engage in First Amendment law on any regular basis. It's hard to keep it all together. So I appreciate that summary. A couple follow-ups for our listeners that I think our listeners would be interested in understanding is understanding that that's sort of the framework for a student at a public or private university. I guess we can stick with public just for the purposes of this question. What are those exceptions, right? Because this past at the graduation time, people were talking a lot about the possibility for free speech being restricted based upon some of these exceptions. And you hinted at it, like the threat of unlawful behavior. But can you briefly summarize, like when can student speech be addressed or restricted, rather?
Well, sure. So let me elaborate some on the subject. Although again, we'll still leave a lot vague. So we need to again look at. Let's just focus on public university student speech. We need to look at whether the restriction focuses on the contents of speech or on its content neutral physical kind of effects. So, for example, a rule that says you can't you can't camp out on university outdoor space. That's constitutional, again, to oversimplify, largely because it's content neutral. Doesn't matter whether you're a racist or anti-racist, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, pro-Israel, anti-Palestinian, pro-Palestinian, doesn't matter. You just can't. That's not what public university open spaces are for. That's permissible. So that's one category of permissible restrictions, content neutral restrictions. A second category is simply that in certain situations, the university gets to choose who is going to be speaking essentially on behalf of the university or in a university organized program. So you mentioned graduation. I'm not sure you were referring to this, but graduation speakers, nobody has a First Amendment right to be a graduation speaker. They're selected by the university. The university may, in fact, select the speaker because of the speaker's viewpoint. They want to invite somebody because that person they think kind of has done great things promoting some particular ideas. Or they decide not to invite somebody because their viewpoints are too controversial. And they may even say, look, we could agree or disagree, but we want somebody who's going to lead people to come away thinking this was a great graduation, rather than, oh, I so disapprove of this person's views, whether the ones that they expressed at the graduation or elsewhere. So now occasionally you see universities inviting someone and then disinviting them. That's always embarrassing for a variety of reasons. But it's not unconstitutional because, again, if the university gets to choose who will speak kind of in a place of honor at their event, then they can undo that. Now, I do think that the graduation is particularly an area where the university has discretion, because the purpose of a graduation speaker, again, is kind of to inspire people, to make them feel good about the day, and the like. If you're talking about a university inviting a scholar to give a talk about scholarly questions, then I don't think the university should be saying, well, we're going to disinvite the person because that person has said some controversial things about other subjects. That particular event should be about scholarship. I don't think it's unconstitutional for the university to disinvite the person in this respect. And even for scholarly talks, presumably viewpoint, the speaker's viewpoint, is one of the things that the university selects the speaker based on. But the university ought to be, again, as a matter of academic ethics, not as a matter of First Amendment law, more open-minded than it needs to be with regard to, say, graduation speakers. Now, we were talking about student speech. Some of the controversy has also been about student graduation speakers, student valedictorians and the like. And my sense is that generally the student valedictorian speaker is not just chosen based on grades, although that's an important factor. They're also chosen as somebody who can kind of convey a good message to the graduates. And if the university says this person is too polarizing, too kind of politically active in ways that will offend one group or another, I think the university is entitled to say, we're not going to invite you. They can't expel the person. They can't deny the person a diploma, but they can say, look, this particular kind of speech that we're choosing someone to give is something that basically the person is speaking on behalf of the university in some respect, or with the imprimatur of the university. So then let's set aside the content neutral ones. Let's set aside kind of the situations where it's somebody speaking on behalf of the university. Let's look at just ordinary students and their speech. So there are exceptions to the First Amendment. So one example is true threats of illegal conduct. So if I were to say to somebody, I'm going to beat you up, that's a threat, and it's punishable. I could go to jail for that. I could certainly be expelled for that or suspended for that. Another example is solicitation of illegal conduct. Oh, here's a list of people we need to beat up. I'm not personally going to do this, but I want to encourage everybody to go after the people on that list. That's a solicitation of crime. Again, that's itself criminal. You could get criminally prosecuted for it. You could get expelled for it. Now, there's also this category of so-called incitement, where even for less personally targeted speech that's more general, like we ought to rise up against our oppressors or something like that, even that could be restricted if the speech is intended to and likely to cause imminent illegal conduct. That's the test for incitement. That's actually really quite rare, because most of the time people aren't saying do it right now. But if they are, let's say if it's in the middle of there's a riot and people are getting up, and even without naming particular names are essentially urging people to do illegal things right away, then that's also punishable. But these are very rare exceptions. Again, there's no hate speech exception to the First Amendment. There's no genocide advocacy speech exception to the First Amendment. There's no racist speech exception to the First Amendment. So for a lot of those things, no, students cannot be expelled or disciplined in any way.
Right. And even in the context of, let's say there's a demonstration in a public forum at a public university, and there are people on both sides of the debate, and members from one group get up and start talking about how in no uncertain terms, like the members of the other group need to be wiped off the face of the earth. Does that qualify as one of those categories of speech that can be restricted, or is it a gray area still?
Well, so it all depends on who's going to be doing the wiping, right?
Got it.
So let's say, for example, somebody gets up and says, we should kill all of our Israeli classmates. that might be solicitation of criminal conduct
Yep.
against solicitation of a crime in America against fellow Americans, or at least against people who are present here. On the other hand, let's say somebody says, it's perfectly proper that Hamas would kill Israelis because it's part of a war. And all of this stuff about how you shouldn't target civilians in war, that's the kind of thing that the powerful use to keep the powerless down. Because the powerful may have precision munitions. Hamas, the only way they can prevail is by killing civilians. How did America win World War? Not win World War II, but essentially, let's say, end World War II in Japan by killing Japanese civilians in two blinks of an eye. If America could do it, Hamas could do it. I actually don't fully agree with that analogy. In fact, I largely disagree with that analogy. But if somebody wants to say that, they have every right to do that. Likewise, if somebody wants to say, look, the only way that Israel can defend itself is by destroying Hamas, by killing every Hamas soldier that it can. Hamas has committed a war crime by embedding itself within civilian population, and that means that if in process of having to kill Hamas, we have to kill a lot of Palestinian civilians, that's just the reality of war. It's on Hamas because they are violating the laws of war by hiding among civilians. I actually do agree with that in considerable measure, although, maybe I'm wrong and I certainly wouldn't, there are limits past which I wouldn't take it. That too, is it calling for killing of people? Yes, because unfortunately, the history of the world has largely been has in large part, not majority, but in large part been a history of people killing other people, and some such killing is inevitable and necessary if you're going to defend yourself. Again, just consider what happened in World War II. So I do think it's very important to focus specifically on what is being said and not talk about generalities. And there's no general exception that says you can't call for the killing of people, because again, then you can't have meaningful discussions about hard and unpleasant truths of war in international relations. On the other hand, if you are talking about killing people in the U.S. and killing particular identifiable people right here on campus, like for example, there was recently a person was sentenced for making threats or for threatening that he would shoot various Jewish targets at Cornell, would shoot up some particular spaces that were used by Jewish students. Well, then that is a punishable threat, and in some situations, maybe punishable solicitation.
Yeah. Fascinating. This stuff really is complicated and difficult to cover in a short period of time. There's a couple other topics that I really want to get to. So I want to come back to the Woke Act if we have time at the end, or the Stop Woke Act if we have time at the end. But I want to turn to another sort of topic that's in the news sort of every day in another public forum, if you can call it that, which is like X and other social media platforms, and the debates that we are having as a society about when these organizations, these private corporate organizations, can and cannot restrict speech. And maybe we start with X just because that's the most high profile one. What is your take on, like, if we rewind the clock to the days before it was owned by Elon Musk, and you have people inside of Twitter at the time making the decision to remove people from the platform for saying things like, what is it? Where does that stand in your eyes and in the eyes of the law?
Sure. So again, it's complicated, and one way of getting at that is to step back a little bit and talk generally about what one might call platforms. Places, real or virtual, where people can speak or that people can use in order to communicate their views, using the property of third parties. So not just using their own things, but using the property of third parties. So you might think of a spectrum. On one end are things like newspapers, magazines. Those are places which may allow people to speak. For example, they may say, oh, submit op-eds to us, submit letters to the editor. But they get to pick and choose which op-eds to publish. And they have every First Amendment right to do so. In fact, the Supreme Court specifically held 50 years ago that a state cannot limit a newspaper's right to include or exclude whatever items it wants. And in fact, it has to do that, right? At least most large newspapers get many more submissions than they could possibly publish. At the very least, while we may not want the government to police misinformation and fake news, we certainly want newspapers to do that, right? We trust our newspapers to protect us as readers from falsehood by publishing things that are true and not publishing things that are false. But beyond that, even if you look at Viewpoint, most newspapers at least claim objectivity, but that's not true for magazines, right? The National Review generally publishes things from more or less the right, New Republic more or less the left. Well, if those magazines had to be viewpoint neutral, there wouldn't be the National Review and the New Republic anymore. We as readers would lose a tremendous amount of value that we get from having magazines and other such institutions that do convey particular viewpoints. So there, both as a First Amendment matter and just a matter of sound policy, you have to have those institutions have the right to pick and choose what's included at that end of the spectrum. Another example is parades. So the Supreme Court said, look, St. Patrick's Day parade can exclude pro-gay rights floats, because this was the organizers' view of what counts as real authentic Irishness, as being straight, or at least not being gay. Well, not everybody's view, maybe not most people's views, but the parade organizer is entitled to craft the parade that the parade organizer wants crafted. Okay, let's look at the other end of the spectrum. What about a phone company? And here I'm talking both about monopolies like landline companies, or at least used to be monopolies, but also the famously competitive cell phone companies, right? So if a phone company says, we don't like you because you're a pro-gay rights group, or perhaps we don't like you because you're a pro-communist group. And we don't like communists, we're capitalists. Or we don't like you because you're racists. They can't cancel your phone line. Even if you're using the phone line in order to promote this ideology that the people and public using, nobody has to listen in. You advertise, you send out leaflets saying, in order to come and register as members of the KKK, call this number. Phone company can't cancel your phone line because it's a so-called common carrier. We've decided that that kind of platform has to be available without regard to ideology. Another example is large shopping malls. As a general matter in most states, large shopping mall as a private property owner can kick out whatever speakers it wants. Like if somebody wants to come and leaflet, it could say this shopping mall is not for leafleting, it's for shopping. Or maybe we allow some people to leaflet, maybe we allow the Salvation Army to come and collect money, but it doesn't mean we'll have to allow the KKK. But in some states, like my own California, state law says large shopping malls have to be platforms for everybody to speak. Now, they don't have to allow large rallies, but if somebody wants to come in and gather signatures or hand out leaflets, they have the right to do that. Supreme Court unanimously held about 45 years ago that a state can indeed mandate private entities to provide access to speakers in order to promote kind of public debate in the marketplace of ideas. So in those states, those shopping malls are more like the phone companies, which can pick and choose. So then the question is, where do we put social media platforms? But I think the right question is, where do we put the various features of social media platforms? I think and here the Supreme Court, this is the Supreme Court's view as well in the recent net choice, Moody v. Net Choice case, is that when a platform is essentially setting up its curated news feed, is saying here are the news that are worth following, maybe based in part on what we know you're interested in. That's like a newspaper. It's dealing with problems of information overload. It is giving people a small subset of all of this stuff out there, and they can pick and choose. They can say, we're not going to include things that we think will be offensive to you as a user, or that are offensive to us, and we don't want to recommend them to you, or we think these things are fake news or whatever else. Now, the other extreme, even on the platform, at least some of the justices suggested that if we're talking about, say, direct messaging on Twitter or on Facebook, maybe email on platforms like Gmail and such, if a state wants to say, look, this is kind of like the phone service. This should be viewed as a common carrier, and the platform shouldn't be blocking individual messages because it doesn't like their viewpoint, that then a state could enforce that law, that a platform doesn't have a First Amendment right to refuse to deliver messages to you from your acquaintances and such, or even from strangers, based on viewpoint. And then the question is, what about things that fall kind of in between? What about, for example, Donald Trump having this @RealDonaldTrump account on Twitter? The Supreme Court said if Twitter doesn't want to, or before Musk, let's say, it didn't want to, allow Trump's messages to appear in its main feed, that would be within its rights. But what about it just deleting the account to the point where even it couldn't be followed even by people who want to follow it? That's an unsolved question. Maybe it's more like the shopping mall, which could be required to allow people to speak and try to speak to the public. What about comments, dealing with comments? There, it's actually a pretty valuable feature that many social media platforms provide, that they can block comments that seem likely to kind of poison the conversation. Certainly, it's really important to be able to block spam comments, but maybe even others as well. So that's the complication here, that there's not one rule that we follow. Oh, anytime there's a platform, the government can mandate viewpoint neutrality. That's absolutely not the rule. See newspapers. But neither is there one rule that says, well, private property is private property. It's sacrosanct, and any private entity can exclude anything it wants, notwithstanding state law to the contrary. That's not right either. See the phone companies. So the question is where the various functions of the social media platforms would fall on that spectrum, and where the lines would be drawn between what's allowed and disallowed.
Yeah, that's super helpful to think about it that way. Like zooming out a bit, I know most of this conversation has been about America, but this incident that's just happening right now, kind of as we speak, with X in Brazil, where
Mm-hmm.
the Brazilian, my understanding of the situation is a high court in Brazil is essentially mad at X for allowing these accounts to stay active on X that they claim are like spreading false news or something, or fake news about them. And in the chatter on X and other platforms in the news, like people are talking about, well, Elon is a free speech absolutist. Like, what does that term even mean to you? And do you agree with it?
So I don't like the term free speech absolutist, because literally it suggests somebody who believes that absolutely all speech is protected by the First Amendment, or should be protected by kind of the private entities. Nobody thinks that. Nobody thinks that if somebody comes up to you in a dark alley and says your money or your life, that's protected speech. Note, let's assume the person doesn't actually show you a gun, so there's no conduct like that. Let's assume the person doesn't actually take your money because you run away or because you shoot him or whatever else. It's just speech. But nobody thinks, well, maybe not nobody, but no justice, no serious commentator that I know of thinks such speech ought to be constitutionally protected. So pretty much everybody agrees there ought to be some true threats exception. Likewise for the solicitation of crime. If I talking to someone else is, you should kill this person. Certainly if I discuss it with them in detail, it could be conspiracy as well as solicitation. It could be all speech. We haven't yet killed the person. But that is indeed criminally punishable. Likewise, child pornography is an example. Copyright infringement is usually done through speech, through publishing certain material. Now, some people do think copyright should be abolished, but it's quite well settled that indeed there is this First Amendment exception, and I think most entities have kind of made their peace with it in some measure. Likewise, I'm not even sure that Elon Musk has that view that broad a view of what should be allowed on Twitter and what shouldn't be. And I've certainly heard allegations that he's restricting some kinds of speech while protecting other kinds. So I don't want to go into detail about what one should think about Elon Musk, but I do think it's pretty clear he's not a free speech absolutist. Probably virtually nobody in the audience for this podcast is a free speech absolutist, even if they think of themselves as free speech absolutists. There have to be exceptions to free speech. But the question is, what should the scope of those exceptions be? Should you say, for example, that certain views are anti-trans or anti-gay or racist and should not be allowed on a platform? And then the question is, like, well, how do you draw that line? What about somebody who says, I think it's bad that certain medals in shouldn't focus on the Olympics, because the Olympics controversies have been a little different than this. But let's say certain medals in just domestic competitions are being won by transgender athletes in women's events. I don't think transgender people who say they're women are really women, or whether or not they're really women. I don't think they should be able to compete against female athletes who've lived their whole lives as female and who haven't had the benefit of male hormones essentially during development. That, as best I can tell, is the view of 2/3 of the U.S. population. And you might think it's hateful, you might think it's evil, but you can't have or you shouldn't have a situation where people are unable to discuss these views. Honestly, on what has become kind of the new public square, albeit privately owned public square. So I think that while there need to be some restrictions on various kinds of speech, including on social media platforms, I do think that the attempts to restrict supposed hate speech on social media platforms, I'm quite skeptical about them. In part because then unsurprisingly people start pushing the definition of hate speech and arguing that, for example, speech critical of transgender athletes in women's sports should be banned, or for that matter, speech that calls for the destruction of Israel should be banned. Again, I don't support the destruction of Israel, but this is an important political and moral question that's being debated, and it seems to me that people should be free to debate it.
Yeah, interesting. What is your take tangentially on AI speech? Is AI speech, first of all, is it protected, and should it be, or should it have its own kind of legal standard?
Well, so again, to oversimplify, I think that the government cannot restrict speech that's produced by AI companies, by AI products, excuse me, any more than it can restrict other speech. So it can't, for example, say, well, we're not going to allow AI companies to ship products that output racist speech. So long as racist speech is protected by the First Amendment, which it is, I don't think the government can say, well, this is AI output. That's different. Or for that matter, we won't allow the companies to produce products that call for violence against police officers or call for violent revolution. The government can't restrict that speech when said by individual humans or by corporations, which are run by humans. Likewise, I think with regard to AI. Now, to be sure, I don't think it's because AIs have free speech rights. Free speech rights are something that people have, and I don't think the AIs are people. But I think AI companies have free speech rights, including the right to produce products that output certain kinds of things. But even setting that aside, the Supreme Court has long recognized that the First Amendment protects our rights as readers and as listeners, and not just as speakers. So if I want to use an AI program, the government shouldn't be able to stop me from getting the output. Let's say I ask it, come up with an argument in favor of violent revolution, come up with an argument in favor of racism or whatever else. I don't think the government should step in and say, no, viewers are going to be denied access to this because we're banning this kind of AI output. What's more, of course, a lot of people use AI to create their own work. Now, sometimes that's unethical, you're a student. You're basically submitting AI output as your own when that is forbidden by the rules of your school. But sometimes, somebody could say, look, I want to come up with a blog post. I feel kind of blocked on it. I know what I want to say, but I'm having a hard time putting in words. Maybe I'm not as eloquent a writer as I'd like it to be. Maybe I'm not as good, especially writing in English. Maybe that's a language that I've only learned recently. I want some AI help. Well, that that's a mean that's a situation where people are using AI tools to produce their own speech, and again, government restrictions on the output of AI tools would undermine people's speech this way. This having been said, when we say AI speech ought to be, or that is, say, the output of AI programs ought to be protected against government restriction, um, that's just shorthand for saying it's as protected as other speech. And there are exceptions to First Amendment protection. So one thing, for example, that I've been studying is when AI outputs defamatory statements, when it outputs false statements like hallucinates supposed scandals that a particular named person was involved in. Well, if you or I were to output this, or if the New York Times were to output this, well, then that would be potentially liable, could lead to civil liability. And I think the same thing, civil liability for the company that publishes it. I think the same thing is true with regard to AI companies when their software outputs libelous material. At least there's the potential of liability. There are currently 2 cases pending in American courts that involve this very question.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that one's likely to come up more and more because AI, you can use AI to produce anything, and AI may or may not be accurate, and be interesting to see how the courts rule on it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, okay, well, we're coming to the end, but I want to do one thing to finish, 2 things to finish it. I want to zoom way out, and then if we have time, zoom back in for one final question. So the zoom out question is this: it seems like the First Amendment is unique, right, in the history of constitutions, written constitutions, and in thinking about like ancient democracies in Rome and Athens, I don't remember reading much about free speech being like top of mind for the thinkers who were involved in those states. Like, what was the philosophical basis for, the founders in coming up with this all important amendment and this principle around free speech? Where did that originate?
Well, first, since you're talking about the history of free speech, including in the ancient era, um, uh, you should be inviting Jakob Mchangama, who's from Denmark. He used actually, I think he's still involved in this think tank in Denmark called Justitia, but he is now at Vanderbilt University working on the Future of Free Speech project. He wrote in 2022 a book called Free Speech: A History from Socrates to Social Media. And he talked about free speech in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Um, there weren't the same kinds of constitutional protections that we have now for free speech, and there were, in fact, punishments for speech. Socrates is a famous example. But at the same time, any um, a political system that calls for some degree of voting by somebody in Athens, it was pretty broad, as I understand it. It was basically the male non-slave citizenry. In Rome, it was also the male non-slave citizenry, but it was so malapportioned that basically the rich had kind of overwhelming influence over it. That is to say, their votes counted for a lot more. But still, in the process, if you're going to have that kind of voting, you have to be able to try to persuade voters. And there were certainly practices of free speech during the Roman Republic, of course, not quite as much during the Empire, and during the democratic era in Greece, where it sort of understood, yes, people would be saying things, including things that call for throwing the bums out, for changing at least who is in the government, even if not necessarily really radical changes to the social order. So you should invite him. He knows a
Sure.
lot more about this than I do. But as to the American conception of free speech, I'm not also a historian of free speech. Again, he would know more, and there are others who are historians of American free speech law. But here's the general big picture. Um, by the time, so the single most important thing I think to know about the American founders, and the single thing that I think helped um, the American not just revolution succeed, maybe not less the revolution and more the American Republic succeed, is that the founders were Englishmen. And they thought of themselves at the start of the revolution as just Englishmen. Eventually, they thought of themselves as Americans, but they were fundamentally Englishmen. They had, at that point, getting on 100 years of relatively free political life. Basically, let's say since the Glorious Revolution in England, 1688, 1689, there was basically a pretty vibrant, free political culture in England. It was not completely free. There were persecutions for so-called seditious libel, for particularly harsh criticisms of the government, or calls, or things that were seen as calls for violence and such. But in fact, there was a lot of harsh criticism of government. There was understood to be a lot of legal principles that supported and protected free speech. And the sense was, if we're going to have again, a system of elections, which they very much did in England, although really it was only the propertied who could vote, and it was malapportioned in lots of ways. Or in America, where the franchise was much more open, where in some places all white males could vote, in other places basically the poor were excluded, but even middle class were very much included. If you're going to have that kind of system, the only way you can have it run is by people being free to explain why it is that some candidates should be voted for and some candidates should be voted against, why some proposed constitution should be enacted and why it shouldn't be. Akhil Amar, who's a law professor at Yale, I think highlighted a very important feature. By the time the Bill of Rights came around, by the time the First Amendment was proposed in 1789, it was proposed by institutions that had come about as a result of the freedom of speech and of the press. The American Revolution was created by free speech, including in American newspapers and pamphlets. That yielded the Articles of Confederation, which were basically then overturned in a peaceful manner through the new Constitutional Convention, whose work product was influenced by what people were saying and what people were writing. And then the work product was enacted into law by the ratifying conventions in the various states, which were themselves influenced by speech and by the press. So like these famous Federalist Papers that were co-written by Madison and Hamilton and Jay, they were published in newspapers, and they were read by people who were thinking about voting on whether to ratify the Constitution or not, especially in the state of New York. So we had already a culture of public debate. It was understood that democracy, in a loose sense, however, it could be really something where people voted directly or less directly. It could be something where a lot of people got the vote or only a smaller portion got the vote. But democracy, or if you prefer a republic, could only function if you really had public debate. So I think it was primarily about democratic self-government in large measure, but there were other things. So for example, in the Address to Inhabitants of Quebec, when Congress was trying to bring the Canadians into the revolutionary project. I oversimplify here, but basically that. One of the things that they stressed is the value of free press is promoting science and promoting knowledge. So that's what people sometimes call the search for truth or marketplace of ideas function of free speech. And I think the framers also understood that free speech was important to self-expression. It was often important to people's religious lives, which were very important to their kind of personal identities. But beyond that, just this is one of the things that free people ought to want to do. Even setting apart its functional utility for democratic self-government, people ought to feel free to express themselves because that's one of the things that makes them feel like they're free people. So all of these things, I think, very much influence the framers. But I think especially the sense that if we're going to have popular government, government where the people are sovereign, again, you can call it a democracy or a republic, you could have a limited franchise or a broader franchise. But if you're going to have a government where people are sovereign, the people have to be able to speak to each other. And when the government restricts that, that interferes with popular sovereignty. One of the things that I think it was Madison that put it this way: in a republic, the censorial power is of the people over the government, and not of the government over the people. So that, I think, probably best captures the framers' thinking on such matters.
Yeah, and thank you for that. Thank you also for the recommendation for a book, which I'm going to check out, and maybe another guest for the show.
Mm-hmm.
If you have time, I have one last question, kind of zooming back into the debates that are raging around the country today. I'm a parent. I have young kids that are 8 and 6, and so I have a lot of conversations with parents about school and the conversation around books and curriculum. And you mentioned this Florida law earlier, but I don't know what the best question is, but maybe it's what's wrong with the Stop Woke Act, or when is it permissible for the state to get involved in the decisions around books and curriculum? Like, maybe that's all too broad, and there's a better question you want to answer, but it's just, I want to get your thoughts on that topic.
Sure. So again, it's a complicated topic, but we can lay out at least three different kinds of questions. One has to do with public school curriculum. K through 12 schooling. K through 12 schooling is provided by the government. It's provided through democratically elected entities like the boards of education and through the legislature. It's funded by the government. It's organized by the government. The government is entitled to pick and choose what's going to be included in it. If the government says, we don't want to teach things that we see as racist, it's free to do that. If the government wants to say, we don't want to teach things that we see as anti-American or as supportive of kids having sex too early or something like that, it's also free to do that. There may be some exceptions with regard to religion under the Establishment Clause. Let's set that aside. As a general matter, the curriculum in public schools is under public control. And if a teacher says, I don't want to teach things this way, I want to teach things another way, the answer is, well, when we hire you to teach our students, you're speaking on behalf of the state. You're not speaking on your own behalf. And we can tell you what to teach and what not to teach and how to teach it and how not to teach it. So as a constitutional matter, I think pretty much all, let's oversimplify here, but basically pretty much all lower courts that have considered this have generally said that the government has extremely broad, maybe almost unlimited power to set the curriculum in public schools. And that individual teachers and individual parents don't have the power to insist that something else be taught beyond what the legislature thinks, or the legislature could assign this to boards of education. The boards of education could assign this to principals, but in any case, it's subject to political control. Now, some kinds of political control may be highly unwise and maybe kind of contrary to good education. Imagine, for example, education that said, you can't teach anything that suggests that America has ever done anything wrong. Well, that would be really bad because that would make it impossible to honestly teach history. Likewise, I think if the government were to say, you can't teach anything that suggests that there may be any differences between the sexes. Well, there are differences between the sexes, and I think even if you don't want to kind of play them up, you need to be able to discuss that. But that's subject to political control. That's not subject to judges stepping in as a constitutional matter. Restricting the legislature's power or the government's power to dictate curriculum. Second question is, what about school libraries? Now, I think there's a very good argument that the school library is part of the school curriculum. It's essentially a set of books that the school wants to encourage kids to read. And if it doesn't want to encourage kids to read a certain book, it can't just ban it. It has no power over what kids read outside of school, but it could say, we're not going to supply it to you in the library with kind of our imprimatur, our recommendation. So that's kind of my view about school libraries. But I will tell you that the courts have been kind of split on this subject. The Supreme Court at one point, back in 1982, in a case called Pico v. Board of Education, actually Board of Education versus Pico, I think, split on this 4-4. There was, of course, there were 9 justices. The tie-breaking justice essentially, for procedural reasons, did not resolve this First Amendment question. So the court split on this, and now lower courts are split on this. For just to give an example, the Fifth Circuit, which is in charge of federal cases in Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana, recently held that you couldn't impose these kinds of restrictions. Again, I oversimplify here. It's a little bit more complicated. It's involved, I think, not just school libraries, but that the First Amendment did limit the government's power to exclude books from libraries. That was a 3-judge panel relying on past Fifth Circuit precedent. Now the whole Fifth Circuit has agreed to reconsider that local precedent. And so different courts have reached different results. Again, I think the answer should be the same as for public school libraries as for public school curricula. But I just have to honestly tell you that courts have a different, or at least courts are unsettled on this. They're pretty clear that the government has authority over the school curriculum, but not necessarily over libraries. The third question is, what about public universities? And again, there's a plausible argument that public universities, nothing magical about university professor, nothing magical about the line between 12th grade and freshman year of college. It's true that in universities, the students are generally adults, but they're still kind of supplied, as it were, by the state. And the state is the one that sets up the universities and pays the teachers' salaries. It should be able to control what is said in the classroom. But again, I will tell you that if you look at the cases on the subject, the Supreme Court has at times suggested that there is protection for professors speaking in their classrooms, so that the dean or the Board of Regents or the legislature can't limit that. And lower courts, quite a few of them, said yes, there is such protection. So at least that area is unsettled. The power of the legislature to restrict speech in K through 12 education, teacher speech, to restrict the curriculum, set the curriculum, notwithstanding what teachers think, is well settled in K through 12. It's unsettled for colleges and universities.
Interesting. And so the theory on the public school curriculum K through 12, the theory is that if the citizenry doesn't like the decisions that are being made by these elected officials with respect to the curriculum, they could just vote them out of office.
Right. And conversely, if they're not voted out of office, it's probably because they are representing what the citizens want. And when the citizens use tax money and state authority to set up the public schools, they can constrain what is taught and how it is taught and what is not taught in public schools. Private schools are a different matter, but public schools are subject to public control. That is the theory. And what they're certainly not subject to is individual teachers. That a teacher is just a state employee, and the state employee can't, the supervisors, including the ultimate supervisors, the people who vote for the legislators, who maybe appoint or vote for the Board of Education, then appoints the principals and so on and so forth, then hires the teachers. The teacher can't tell his boss, oh, I'm going to teach it my way, boss, and not the way you want me taught. The boss has the power to control what K through 12 teachers teach and how they teach it, but not with regard to universities. And again, one can question whether the same rule should apply to universities. But again, descriptively, that's there seems to be at least a good deal of authority for the proposition that public university professors do have a lot of control that cannot be kind of overruled by the legislature or by their dean or by their chancellor or by the regents over what they teach and how they teach it. But K through 12 teachers do not have such control.
Eugene, thank you so much for your time. This has been a really good, really helpful conversation. And I think will be, well received by the audience. People will learn a lot listening to this. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.